I'm going to talk a bit about the research questions, a bit about the process, highlight some emerging themes, and also hopefully open up to some feedback and discussion. Be really grateful to hear any comments you have to help us as we keep going through this project. Okay. So this research is happening here in Belize in the context of its international characterization as a small developing state, particularly under the climate change framework. So important factors to take into consideration when we're looking at environmental decision-making in Belize include legacies of colonialism, legacies of external technical assistance, domestic and international territorial disputes, and also the recognized vulnerability to various climate change impacts and the impacts of climate variability on different timescales. And recent and current policy developments here in Belize make these areas of research timely as well. So there's a few examples on the screen of kind of policies from the late 2000s which have been working towards things like integrated water resources management, climate change adaptation, and integrated water resources through the Act in 2010. And so these cover really vital areas such as biodiversity, climate change, water management, and river planning. And I know University of Belize are doing some really important work at the moment in the Belize River Valley watershed as well. And so my focus here is going to be on the social dimensions of watershed management and what an anthropological approach can maybe contribute to some of these developments. So what does the social dimensions of watershed management mean? We can think about kind of perspectives on water in 3 different ways if we follow some work that was done by Ben Orlov and Stephen Caton. And they've kind of addressed 3 different perspectives on water management or on understanding water from a holistic social perspective. And they talk about, firstly, watersheds. And this is what is familiar perhaps from hydrological science, the geographical extent of river basement catchments as the unit of analysis, using data to inform ourselves about environments and the hydrological aspect of them. But there are also other ways of thinking about water. We can think about water regimes. So this is the rules and regulations, the institutions and organizations that are involved in managing water and deciding about allocations and governance. And these might have very different kinds of boundaries from the hydrological catchment boundaries, for example. They might be at village level, they might be to do with the boundaries of protected areas, or they might be to do with international borders, which, as you can see from the first picture, the watershed boundaries don't always align with the political boundaries. And there's also another aspect we might want to think of, which Orlov and Caton refer to as waterscapes. And this thinks about the meaningful engagements in the cultural and spiritual aspects of water. So what does water do in terms of helping us to form senses of place and belonging and community and identity? And how do these connect with everyday life for people who depend on these resources, who use them on a day-to-day basis? So in terms of this project, we're drawing on themes from political ecology, from anthropology, and from science studies to try and think about kind of a historical context. How did we get to a current focus on data-led integrated water resources management, not just in Belize, but on a regional and even a global scale as well? And trying to understand through fieldwork, through long-term interactions, how scientists and non-scientists, as they might be classified, interact during research and in project implementation. And these boundaries are quite fluid, really. It's not always that clear who belongs into which category there. So how do different groups of people, whether they're rural residents, government representatives, NGOs, or members of civil society, talk about water? How do they translate different concepts? And what are the implications of that for the kinds of projects and the kind of actions that emerge in these assessments and projects? And what does it mean for the people who live in these areas to be involved in those conversations in a meaningful way? And in light of these questions, what might be the opportunities and challenges of bringing in emerging technologies such as GIS and emerging scientific practices such as citizen science into these kinds of conversations. So the work, the fieldwork that was undertaken for this over a period of about 4 months last summer, between April and August, focused on 2 sets of communities, one in northern Stann Creek and then also in Toledo district. And we carried out the fieldwork using ethnography, participant observation, in-depth interviews with community members and scientists and NGO staff. Some house-to-house surveys for which we received really good support from the NRM, the Natural Resource Management Program's internship program here at UB. And also focus groups involving participatory mapping exercises and expeditions to get to know the watershed on a practical level. So these were undertaken in places where we'd identified that there were projects or activities underway relating to watershed assessment and management. And this isn't the first time that people have been carrying out research onto watershed issues in Belize. There's previous research, there's ongoing research that we're trying to feed into. A lot of work so far is focused on water quality, on groundwater assessment, on aquatic ecology, protected areas, and human impact mapping. But to date, quite a lot of this research has been fairly fragmentary. It's not all been brought together. And the social and cultural dimension has been somewhat limited, although, as I said, there are plenty of projects starting to work on this now. And we thought we wanted to emphasize the importance of place in history, the fact that these projects and assessments are not happening in a vacuum, and that often there might be complications or histories of controversy in some of the communities where these are happening, whether that's between NGOs and governments or private companies, to do with extraction, enclosure, and pollution and protection. So we wanted to try and get an understanding of some of these contexts and consider the different kinds of boundaries, the different governance structures, and the different forms of co-management that are being implemented at the moment. So who is included and who is not included in these conversations and assessments. So just to give a brief overview of a couple of the case studies and some of the emerging themes in the context where we're working. The first one was looking at headwaters protection in the citrus belt, so primarily along the Stann Creek Valley Road. So this is in the citrus belt. There's been a degree of population and economic change over recent years in this area. And the valley is really a watershed feature that helps to define the cultural and economic character of the area, as well as the Valley Road, which provides a very important infrastructural link and connection for the communities that lie in series along it. And in particular, we were interested in the co-management of the Billy Barker Deer National Park, which is in this region. And this is co-managed by a community-based organisation called STACA, the Steadfast Tourism and Conservation Association. And it is a sub-watershed of the North Stann Creek, and the national park covers about 660 hectares. And the CBO that co-manages it grew out of opposition in the mid-90s to agriculture and logging plans to develop the hillsides in that area, and through opposition to that based on community awareness and also scientific studies about the erosion threats. And their focus on both tourism and conservation really focuses around the language of watersheds and the protection of these headwaters, particularly because a dam that is situated above the waterfall in the national park provides potable water for up to 3 of those neighbouring buffer communities. So there's a direct connection here between the health of the forest and the environment and the health of the local people who rely on it. And the responsibility for monitoring and managing that water is quite complicated. There are several different organisations involved here. So, for example, the CBO, but also the village water boards and external organisations such as Belizean and foreign universities. There are important questions to answer, such as how to balance the need for tourism income with the exclusion of human activities near the water source, and also identifying the extent of the problem for assessment and intervention, So the water source and a lot of the testing that's going on is happening within the national park, but there are also broader questions relating to the wider watershed, all the way down to Dangriga. So we were interested in how the processes of doing water quality monitoring and assessment feed into some of these problems and these ongoing debates. So there's a program by which the University of Belize does some in-kind water quality monitoring as a service to the community here. And that involves UB staff, students, and also the rangers of the CBO. And they have to negotiate different objectives for this program. So are they seeking to create a baseline which could be the basis for wider comparative studies elsewhere in the watershed? Are they tracking the status of the drinking water and making cases for or against future alterations to the water system? These kind of questions might need different kind of scientific approaches, so there's a lot of debate going on about what should be done in terms of collecting data and analysing this. So it's important for us to examine the social and political dimensions of how decisions about water systems in the future are debated and acted upon. I can continue and we'll see if that comes back, if that's okay. And so I'll talk just briefly about the other case study, which was in Toledo district. And as most of you will know, this is a situation where the communal land rights of the Maya have recently been affirmed in the courts, but the practical implications of these for land tenure and land use are so far unresolved, and there's a lot of ongoing debate about the legal implications and the practical implications, and a dynamic cultural politics in this part of Toledo and this part of Belize. NGOs have had a strong role in providing various services in Toledo that elsewhere might have been provided by the government, but various different historical failures of some of these projects have meant there's this kind of wariness of external interventions, and a lot of debate going on about who should be involved in assessment and intervention projects. And quite a few of the NGOs have been undertaking or attempting to undertake interventions that do relate to watersheds. But one of the things we did find is quite a lot of difference in the definitions of watersheds and what people think about when these projects are promoted and described. So, for example, when we were talking to participants about how they understood the concept of a watershed as it was presented in these projects, many participants referred to the 66-foot riparian buffer that's required by law, rather than perhaps the wider scientific definition of an area within which watercourses drain into a particular river. And this might be attributed to the prevalence of NGO projects that have focused on buffer protection particularly. And it is the case that some local NGOs are now moving to use the terminology of landscape instead as what they think might be a more translatable concept. So we're interested in finding out what the implications of that change in terminology might be. Meanwhile, some of the Kekchi participants in this area reflected on connections between the idea of the watershed and the idea of the Sultak and the areas that are imbued with spiritual meaning that connect mountains and valleys. So taking these different definitions into account, and also the historical and political context here, we need to ask who gets to define and set agendas for resource management, and maintain that as a key question. Okay. So just to sum up a few of the emerging themes that we're going to keep looking at as we go through the analysis of this project. A lot of these assessments and these interventions involve a combination of top-down and bottom-up decisions and responsibilities. And we're really quite interested in what happens in the in-between here and how concepts get translated on the ground. And also particularly the role of what we might call brokers, so individuals and organizations who kind of move in between different levels of governance and inhabit and traverse multiple roles. So these could be residents who are also activists, rangers, leaders, and students. And we also want to think about watershed projects in a wider context of ideas about nature, infrastructure, and bodily health. And think about water resources, but also other utilities such as electricity. And what are the issues of availability and cost which influence how citizens in rural areas encounter the state? And we also want to think about links between the health of environments and the health of bodies. So water quality is something that is experienced directly in the bodies of people, as well as measured by instruments and laboratory tests. So perhaps bringing these things together and moving beyond an opposition between scientific and local or traditional knowledge to take environmental perception and political dynamics seriously, and also to pay attention and take care over our own roles as anthropologists and researchers, being mindful of whose knowledge and time is given in these processes, how that time is taken and valued in resource assessment and intervention projects, but also in anthropological research. So just to wrap up with a couple of points about the next steps. As I mentioned, this is all kind of early stages and our analysis is definitely ongoing. We're planning a return trip in July to undertake some community meetings with the respondents and participants we were working with, and also multi-stakeholder workshops to try and widen this conversation to other people who are interested. And also think about useful outputs for this kind of research. So not just the academic papers and conference presentations that we could that could come out of this, but also materials that would be helpful, useful to the communities, to policymakers, and to NGOs who are engaging in this kind of work. So if anyone has ideas or suggestions or would like to be part of that process, then I'd encourage you to get in touch. Do contact me. I'll be around for the next couple of days as well. And thank you for your time.